like,
Yeah.
but so
Ian.
Yeah, should I get something to prop this up so I can turn it horizontal without cutting off the top of my head or having to hold it like this? Or does it matter if
you have a laptop in front of you, I find that's really perfect because you can actually slant the laptop and put yourself.
I'm using my iPad. The sound is messed up on my laptop.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, you might want to grab something to prop it up. That might be good. And then Anya, did you build in any time for audience questions, or are you just going to go the full hour? Either way, it's totally fine.
I'm happy to take audience questions. I just need to know how we're getting them. Are they going to come in the chat? I can tell people at the beginning to put them in the chat.
So nobody else is going to be in Zoom, but what I can do is keep an eye on the Discord server, which is where people are typing, and then I'll type them into the chat for you so you can see them.
Perfect. So you have a Discord that's with the panels. Okay, that's great. Actually, if you could tell people that when you come on, tell people how to ask the questions, that would be great. But yeah, if anyone have questions, we'll do a Q&A at the end. If people don't, we'll just keep talking until the time's up, you know? Okay. Either way, but I'm sure
we're broadcasting through YouTube to Eventive, and there's a little banner at the bottom that says join the discussion on our Discord server with the invite link there, so that people will see that no matter when they come into the broadcast. And
I moved that because it's covering something.
Oh, okay. Fred just said he moved that because it was covering someone, but well.
Is my audio clear with the camera far away? It says it in the waiting screen.
I can see it. It says it in the waiting screen. Okay. I can see and hear you. Can everyone else see and hear Ian?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to make sure you could hear me okay, because I had to move the iPad back.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Cool.
Oh, good. Okay. And then are there any other questions? Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sunday of the H.P. Lovecraft Film Festival. I'm Gwen Callahan, one of the directors, and I'm here to welcome Anya Martin, Eden Royce, Gwendolyn Keist, Craig Gidney, and Ian McDowell for their panel, We Once Were Monster Kids. Anya's going to be moderating the panel for us, and she is going to be taking questions from the audience at the end. So if you have any questions, please hop on the HP Lovecraft Film Festival Discord server. I will type the invite into the YouTube chat, and if anyone is looking for that, it's also on our Facebook event. And yeah, if you have questions for them, type them into the Discord server. We'll be keeping an eye on it. And with that, I am going to say adieu and let Anya and these fine panelists take it away. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Gwen. It's always a pleasure to panel at HPLFF. Sorry we couldn't be there in person. Maybe next year that'll be possible. It was really exciting that the film festival did get to take place in some form last weekend. So I wanted to start out by us introducing ourselves. I'll just go first and say that I am Anya Martin. I'm a writer. This is my collection, Sleeping with the Monster. I am also in the book Cootie Shot Required from Broken Eye, which Eden is in as well, and actually inspired me to pitch this panel. Not only did I think it would be fun, but here is an anthology that came out from Broken Eye, who are a big friend of HPLFF and always in the dealer's room and everything, that came out last year. Well, it came out late last year and then into this year. I think it actually was available in hardcover. It was available virtually last year. So the other thing I'll tell you is I am the co-host and co-producer with Scott Nicolay of the Outer Dark podcast, and we are recording this podcast to air in the Outer Dark later. So throughout this we'll be recommending some books and things like that, and we'll have links to those and everything when we do the podcast later. If you want to, it'll be worth relisting, or just for the extras that we'll try to put in for that. Anyway, panelists, do you want to, if you'd like to introduce yourself, let's start with Eden.
Hi, I'm Ian McDowell. I am a fiction writer and journalist in Greensboro, North Carolina. I have done a couple of fantasy novels and a variety of horror stories. And I'm the author and artist of Alpha Bestiary, 26 poems and drawings for easily alarmed children and the adults who like to alarm them, such as the Krampus and the Mome Rath, Nosferatu, a bunch of others. And I'm a very old school monster kid in that I am of the tail end of the original Monster Kid generation in the 60s and early 70s.
Okay, Eden.
Hi, I'm Eden Royce. I am a writer from Charleston, South Carolina. I am sounds so strange to say this, but I'm a Shirley Jackson Award nominated writer for my story in Cootie Shot Required, which is called Room and Board Included, Demonology Extra. I'm also the author of this book, Root Magic, which is my debut novel, a Southern Gothic middle grade set in my home state of South Carolina, with lots of monsters, magic, and local folklore.
Gwendolyn.
I'm Gwendolyn Keist, and I'm the author of The Rust Maidens, Bones, Set, and Feathers, and Her Smile Will Untether the Universe. And my next novel should be due out next year, Reluctant Immortals, from Saga Press. And yeah, I've loved monsters since I was a kid as well. So I'm really just very excited to be here.
And Craig.
I'm an author based in Washington, D.C. I'm the author of A Spectral Hue and a bunch of other books, short fiction. And I guess I identify with monsters.
So some of you already started answering my first question. I thought it would be fun to start with going back to our childhood. And I'd like to ask the panelists about your own childhood experiences and pop culture favorites that laid a foundation for your horror and weird fiction. I'm sure we could just talk about that for the whole panel and longer, but maybe you could, summarize a little bit or pull out something that was particularly key that helped ground you in your love of and fascination with monsters and horror. and the weird. Who wants to go first?
You should probably just.
Ian, you can go first since you started.
I guess
you're ready to talk.
I gotta go. Because my monster initiation probably dates back to 1966 because I'm bloody ancient. And I was a reptile kid and a dinosaur kid. I'm not sure which came first, current reptiles or dinosaurs. But I was fascinated by both, and I was encouraged by my librarian mother who died when I was 7. And then one day I was eating with her at the luncheon counter at Sears, and she sent me to wander off into the toy department. And I encountered the creature from the Black Lagoon. He was not a mask like this, which I would have loved to have owned then. Unfortunately, the over-the-head creature masks they sold back then were $17, which, while this one cost $19, $17 was a lot more in 1966. But I was fascinated by the Aurora model of him because he was a fish man, but he also was kind of a lizard man. And that led me to the other Aurora model kits of classic movie monsters that were a big item in toy stores in the 60s. This is a 90s reproduction that the cats knocked over. I need to glue them back together of Godzilla. Missing a leg there and a foot. It's not the original, or I wouldn't have put it someplace where the cats could get to it. But also, that's how I discovered Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolfman, Phantom of the Opera, and the rest. And then at some point after my mom died, Dad let me stay up to watch Shock Theater to see the original Frankenstein and Dracula. And about the same time, I was starting to discover horror fiction and like classic kids anthologies like Tales to Tremble By, or the much better More Tales to Tremble By. And I was starting to enjoy getting scared. And that was the start there. That's it.
Okay.
I'll go because I keep laughing, so it keeps coming over to me anyways. So both my parents are into horror and always really were. They got married on Halloween. They just always, I've always loved horror. And so I don't really ever remember a time when it wasn't on. Like, if it's Saturday afternoon when I was a kid, we were watching a Hammer movie. There were always like, a double feature in the afternoon, at least where we were. And so it was like Hammer movies. And, I have no idea how little I was when I saw the first like Frankenstein for the first time, or Dracula, but I know I was really little. I never really remember a time without them. So it's sort of like almost like monsters are like my aunts and uncles, right? Like I feel like they were always there. They're like members of my family. So yeah, like it's always been there, and it's always just sort of been in the background of my life, and obviously now the foreground is being a horror writer. So
I'll go next. I have a similar experience to Gwendolyn in that it was Sunday afternoons that those old Hammer movies came on where I lived, and I would always watch them with my mother and grandmother, who would probably never admit to necessarily being into horror, but they just absolutely loved the atmosphere and just the tension of those shows. I also read a lot of Goosebumps, and I was always into the scary stories that my grandmother told me that were folklore, monsters and creatures that lived in the swamp and the marshes in and along the South Carolina coast where I grew up. So a combination of those mixed with dark fairy tales, those original endings that were always bloody and completely without remorse as to punishing the baddies. I was always into those and just strangely fascinated by the horror and the creep of it. And also being from a hoodoo culture, I got a lot of commentary from other kids about how I was creepy. So I had to, of course, learn at an early age to just embrace all of it.
Well, I'd say that it's very similar in that for me, it was 4 o'clock after school. For some reason, someone in the DC area decided to play horror movies. And so I would come home from school and there'd be The Exorcist on, or something, or The Omen, or the monsters that imprinted on me, which were the tiny monsters, such as Don't Be Afraid of the Dark and Trilogy of Terror, that little thing that ran around screaming and biting Karen Black's leg. And so that was for me, you eat an afternoon snack and you watch these things. And hopefully your mother isn't watching while you're watching these things, because I don't think she necessarily wanted me to watch those things. And plus, we had this kids show host that doubled as a Dracula sort of Elvira type character named Count Gord, let's see, Gord Duvall or something
Yeah.
like that. And he would show horror movies on Saturday nights.
I love that the afternoon programming in DC was that like that's
Right, exactly. It was post Nixon, so maybe they were just like, whatever.
Yeah, my afternoon programming was a syndicated show called Dialing for Dollars, where I would come home from school to see something like the She Creature or Gigantus the Fire Monster, and the host would every so often call local homes in the area to see if they were watching the program, and you could win money. I never was interested in that. I just wanted to see the movies.
Yeah. So when I was about 2 or 3, my parents watched Dark Shadows. And I think that I don't know whether I would have ended up, I think I would have ended up the same way, but it just started early. I don't remember a time when I didn't watch monster movies or monster TV or wasn't interested in horror. I wanted to dress as witch for Halloween. I loved Halloween. I empathized with, I know I'd seen the Vincent Price Wax Museum by the time I was 3 or 4, because I had a dream about it. That was one of the few dreams that I remembered from my childhood. And later, when we moved to Atlanta, when I was about 7, they had Friday Night Frights with a horror host on what became TBS, that Turner Broadcasting. And I saw on there, I guess first the Universal movies, the AIP movies, the Toho movies, the Hammer movies. My dad took me to see when they re-released King Kong in the unedited version, because it was edited for years, because you could see, I guess, Fay Wray's boobs maybe slightly through her diaphanous dress, and so that was edited out. But then they re-released that and Fay Wray was actually at that screening in Atlanta in the 70s. And then there was like a Dracula film, vampire film, the High Museum of Art. These are like, important things that I did as a child. Later, I got interested in science fiction, but I feel like I was always interested in horror. We did seances and ghost stories at slumber parties. We play witches. I love this book, The Witch Family by Eleanor Estes, which also Poppy Z. Bright, Billy Martin also loves this book. I was excited to learn via Facebook. So, that's sort of how I grew up. But let's now seg into writing about children. There certainly are a lot of horror stories and horror films and novels that center around child protagonists. And some of them are more straight horror, some of them are comedy horror, some are young adults. Certainly YA fiction now has just been taken over by that. But let's go back a little further, sort of before Stranger Things. The whole reason why Stranger Things, I think, is popular is because people were already, attuned to the sensitivity. Do you think that, I think probably we all agree, but I'd like to get your thoughts on, are children just more attuned to the weird, to belief in the supernatural? Are children, is that why we see so many children protagonists? Because it was a more innocent time, but also a time when you hadn't been totally stunted by realism yet.
I like that. I do think that there's some, like, childhood is strange. I mean, I think back on childhood, like everything is new and everything seems weird. And I've heard other people say, like, sometimes something really big will happen to you and you won't realize it was something really big, but because everything is, brand new when you're a kid. And I do think I remember my childhood seemed very, very strange. And I think there's also the fact that we have an instinct to protect kids. I think, that's kind of built into most of us anyways. And so I think putting them in horror situations, it kind of, without even having to do character building, if it's an adult, a lot of times people in a horror movie will be like, oh, they should know better. But like, it's pretty mean to say that about a kid, right? Like, oh, a kid should just know better to run from that monster. So I think in some ways it could be that, we have that protective instinct and that there is the innocence of it. And then also that just, I do think kids are more open to the possibility of things. As we get older, we get more jaded, I think. That may be cynical, but I do think there's at least a little bit of that. I think kids are more open to things.
Yeah, there's been a tradition of child protagonists. I mean, it wasn't that common, but child protagonist in adult horror fiction or adult weird fiction. Anything from Serendi Vashtar to The Unfortunate Kid and David Keller's The Thing in the Cellar, who's the only one who knows there's a monster in the cellar, which actually reminds me, we had folkloric childhood monsters in my suburb of Fayetteville, North Carolina, when growing up in the 60s. We had the Chain Man, who was supposed to be able to manifest somehow in anybody's basement. And he was this awful rotting guy covered in chains. I don't think he had an organ, remember. Oddly enough, we also had some, I don't know that we called it that, we had some version of the Thunderbird. There was a giant bird that was supposed to swoop down out of the sky and swoop kids up and eat them. And I have no idea what this Western folklore was doing in North Carolina, that part of North Carolina. But I actually was begging my parents to buy me a bow and arrow set with, pointed arrows so that I could shoot the Thunderbird if it came after me, because I knew that a BB gun wouldn't do the trick.
I remember being terrified of Skylab. So I would go running every time I thought anything was possible. I thought I was a child of a sorceress that had been left behind. I thought all sorts of wild and crazy sort of things because I was always the sort of weird kid. And the weird kid, I would go to the forest. I lived across from a gigantic forest, and I believed that the birds that would swoop around would be able to talk to me. So I think that kids are kind of, particularly weird kids, or that they naturally gravitate towards that sort of material.
It's an imagination font, kids, they have endless possibilities. They think anything can happen. I know I did at that age where you just imagine, lose yourself in an imagination on like a long car trip or a bus ride, just something to engage that mind that keeps running into every possibility. And then when you give it fodder, like I had with Twilight Zone and Hitchcock movies and all of that sort of stuff, stories that my mother told me from when she went to see the birds in the theater, and birds swooped out of a nearby tree and she almost completely lost it. So when you have that fuel as well, you can't help but let that imagination run wild as a kid.
So is it, oh, sorry.
It just reminded me, somebody I forgot to give credit for. We had a housekeeper, traditional Southern Black housekeeper, early 60s, working mom. And she was obsessed with horror movies that she usually saw at the downtown theaters in Fayetteville at the time. And she would recite them to me. She would tell me the plots exactly. And over the years, I've discovered all these early 60s, often quite graphic usually Italian horror movies, and realized that this is something that she told me when I was 5 years old. And I would have this sudden recognition. So that actually, she was a huge influence that I should credit more than I have.
So children seem often braver than adults in these stories. Reading these stories now as adults, has your perspective changed? Are you more afraid for those children? Are those stories more disturbing for you because those children were brave? So brave. I can think of, a story that probably isn't heavily read now, but but was a classic in a lot of those horror anthologies, The Shed by E. Everett Evans, which is about a bunch of kids who there's a shadow in the shed that's never really explained. The shed where they play. And the story has, not everybody gets, I don't want to spoiler it, but it's for an adult reader, I could see that there might be a different attitude than the kids at the end of the story, or throughout the story, kind of how they sort of encounter and deal with this.
Well, what is the thing? Oh, well, one of the things I've noticed in kids sort of horror things is that there's this thing where the adults are they can't perceive whatever the thing is, and it goes from it to even something like A Wrinkle in Time to where people, it's not attuned towards the adults. And also The Dark is Rising, those sorts of things where the evil is not perceived by adults and it mostly attacks children. And there is something about that that I think also makes for very interesting storytelling too, because the kids don't have to figure it out on their own, because the adults are like, oh, you're just crazy, you have a crazy imagination.
I find these perspectives by people who are shaped by young adult fiction and stuff that came along after I was a kid fascinating, because for me, the only young adult classic that I encountered as a kid, or the only, was A Wrinkle in Time, which we read in my 6th grade class, and The Hobbit, of course, which my mom read to me before she read The Lord of the Rings. But so I was a kid encountering much older horror fiction written for adults, in which kids were menaced, and that terrified me. Like The Thing in the Cellar was just a childhood nightmare. I started the story when I was 7 and couldn't bear to finish. I flipped to the end and saw that the kid was torn to pieces. Spoiler. And I could not bear to finish it until I was probably 10 or 11. The same thing with the first story in More Tales to Tremble By, which no kids die, but kids are menaced. The Red Lodge by Wakefield. I could not finish that story until a year or 2 later. And so it was a huge trauma and a huge taboo when kids died in fiction. As an adult, it doesn't bother me. I've killed off kids in my own fiction, but I'm not a parent.
Yeah, I was thinking that. I don't know. I haven't seen any of us talk about having kids on social media, so I'm not sure we have any parents on the panel, do we? I don't think that we do. So that's an interesting, I sometimes wonder, would that have a different effect if I was a parent? I don't know. I'm not sure. It's one of those things. I don't have an alternate timeline version in which I'm a parent, but I will say I'm the opposite of you though, Ian. I actually, as a kid, if I saw things that kids got killed and I'd be like, okay. But as an adult, I actually am more upset by it. Like as a kid, it seems like, yeah, totally. Like my parents I feel like, especially as a kid and like growing up in the 80s and 90s, parents were constantly telling you everything was going to kill you. Like everything, like don't go near that aspirin. You'll swallow all of them. That's why it's got a childproof cap. Like everything became scary. And so the thought of like kids dying, I'm like, well, of course they're going to die. Like everything's dangerous. It's amazing I'm getting through the day. But then as an adult, I'm like, no, it's not really quite that dangerous. And so it's actually more upsetting to me as an adult when I'm like, oh no, little kids. But like my husband found this book, like we had to like locate, I forget the name of it. I'll try to put it on social media later if I think of it. But like the kids get killed constantly at the end of it. And it creeped him out as a kid. But like I'm reading it now as an adult, like, this is terrible. These poor little kids. And yet, when you're a little kid reading it, you're like, you know. I also love what you said, Craig, about the evil not being perceived by adults. That was so scary as a child, because it feels like you were in a different world than adults to begin with. And that there was this big disconnect, even though they have all the power over the whole world, but they don't seem to be on the same page as you. So I agree that that kind of stuff was really scary as a child, because it felt like it hit very close to home.
Yeah, I feel like there might be there's two kinds of stories, horror stories with kids.
Yeah.
There are the stories like these where there is some way you can get beyond this. There's some kind of magic, or you can access magic, or some kind of way to defeat the monster. You can do it with your ingenuity. And I mean, my story and Cootie Shot require the things we need to kill Squish. I mean, these kids, these little girls, this group of girls, because I wrote purposely about little girls, because I never was reading a story about a group of little girls. There was one little girl hanging out with the boys, and that was it. And that girl was kind of like some manic pixie, the manic pixie tomboy that hung out with the girls, which never happened in my school, ever. We did not, we interacted with boys. There would be something, but we never, like, one of us never went off with the boys, to my knowledge, ever. We would do these things together. We went and explored the creek. We had a slumber party, etc. Both me and my best friend Julie, and then later on my friend Susan when I changed schools. And then sometimes my friends Julie, Trudy, and Carolyn, and sometimes Kimberly and Audrey would do stuff together. So, I mean, in elementary school, when I had friends before I changed schools in 7th grade, which was social death. That's another story, you know, when I had, you know. But when I read things like, say, I was really, really disturbed by The Lovely Bones, which at the end of chapter 2, Jess was like, my God, that girl is dead. She's dead at the end of chapter 2. There's no coming back as an angel. She's dead as by a child molester in the neighborhood. I think of the time that this dude in a green sedan pulled up next to me when I was walking home from school, and he asked me if I wanted to see his rubber thumb. And I thought, oh, this is like some magic trick thing, you know, like from a magic store, like rubber, you know, rubber body parts. It never occurred to me it was anything but that, but I still was freaked out. And he followed me for a while, and I was just like, what am I going to do? At that point, I actually thought I'll have to scream, go run on, bang on someone's door, like you're going to bang on a stranger's door. But it was in a neighborhood where I felt like, you know, that was safer than this guy. Luckily, he drove off. But then I never told anybody because I was so embarrassed by this whole situation. And then I told my mother several years later, and she's looked at me and said, you know, that wasn't a rubber thumb. And then I thought, oh my God, what did I come so close to? Yeah. What if I had looked? What if I can't imagine you know, getting in the car or anything. I knew not to talk to strangers. But that's infinitely more terrifying to me, reading a realistic story about where a child is in danger or murdered. But these fantasy stories were kind of like, I wanted to be there. I wanted to do that. I could, you know, I want to be the kids in Stranger Things. I'd go back and be that, even though that was tremendously scary and they might not have gotten out alive.
Well, do you think
the trauma with Elle and is actually more disturbing than anything with monsters, the real life stuff. But anyway.
Well, do you think that sometimes the kids in these adventure things, like the Narnia kids, would have to go to like therapists or something to, you know, deal with the fact that I went and there was magic and then they kicked me out when I was 15 because I liked makeup or something like that.
Nylons, yeah.
Right. I always wonder about that.
Yeah. I think a lot of us probably needed therapy from childhood anyways. I think I still would have taken the fun magical stuff and then also needed therapy, right?
Wasn't the fun magical stuff instead of therapy? Because if you weren't particularly popular, you weren't, you know, you didn't feel like you fit in, that gave you a home, something you could do by yourself.
Yeah, there's
watch a movie.
There's Theodore Sturgeon's great bog monster story. It, which I presume is the first bog monster story, where a farm family runs afoul of this creature that's formed around the bones of a dead traveling salesman in the molds, in the muck. And it's a big, humanoid blob thing. And it alternates between the point of view of various characters, one of which is the monster itself, which it only tears people apart out of curiosity. It's curious about everything, but it settles on finally the protagonist, the young girl, Babe, whose father is dead, but did not become the monster, but whose uncle does become the monster's victim. And Babe is eventually the monster's downfall. She is the hero of the story, and Sturgeon gets inside her head really well. But even as a kid, I was haunted by the last line of the story, where the monster, she throws a rock, and I can't say it without spoiling. I won't tell you what happens to the monster. But after it's all over, the last line of the story is that everything is fine with the family, but they didn't have Alvin, and they didn't have the dog. And Babe screams at night and has grown very thin. And I think that's probably the first story I ever read that actually dealt with PTSD, with trauma after the fact. And I never thought about this before, but it's really prescient in that way.
Yeah, so many stories end before you really see all those ramifications. But yeah, that's so fascinating, because that's like where a lot of real life happens, is after things happen.
Yeah.
Right?
So Eden, you're from South Carolina, and it sounds like in your world, maybe magic was a little bit more some kind of, the hoodoo is somewhat, maybe you grew up in a situation where magic was a little more accessible than the rest of us, where magic was something we really deeply desired, but was still a little distance from us.
And, growing up in a hoodoo culture, I don't know that I necessarily saw it as magic per se. It was just what you did. It was everyday occurrences. It was what you were taught from the time that you can remember, to do certain things that you don't realize until much later in your life. And you look back and you go, oh, that was a ritual I didn't even realize. Like, parents tell you to be careful of strangers and not to go to a certain area of town or whatever have you. It's just woven into your upbringing so tightly and so closely that you don't necessarily see it as a magical thing that you learn to do separately. It just sort of is a part of your growing up. When I was little, I still thought of magic as that sort of wave your fingertips or wave a wand around and some beam of light comes out and morphs something into a different shape. So I always saw, quote unquote magic as that Hollywood magic, where it was sort of sparkle, bang, boom, not something that is more of a folk magic of, almost like a kitchen magic and mixing things and pouring things together, which is just sort of not as flamboyant visually, but is still just part of growing up and still a powerful tradition.
So what about when the kids are kind of the monsters?
Mm-hmm.
Which also happens in horror fiction, where kids are characters.
Was that a thing that kind of started, like, the first one I think of is The Omen. I mean, that's the first one that comes to mind. Are there earlier ones? I'm sure there are, but I'm not immediately, I feel like that became a more common thing in like the 70s and 80s, but are there ones from like the 30s?
There is the Bad Seed.
Yeah, the Bad Seed.
Yeah, Bad Seed, definitely. There's
she was a psychopath, I guess.
Yeah.
She's adorable in the movie too. She had those little pigtails, and she was so evil. She scared me so much as a kid. So that's the type of little girl that got away with everything, and like she would bully you, and you'd be like, "She's doing this," and it's like, "No, look how cute she is in her little pigtails," and it's like, she's mean. Like, she scared me. That seemed really realistic.
Yeah. There was because here in Greensboro, we had the classic pulp writer Jane Rice, who was one of John W. Campbell's favorite writers at Unknown Worlds, even though Campbell wasn't really known for his support for female writers. But she was like the pulp's Shirley Jackson. I've written an article about her, which The Outer Dark has reprinted. But she had the classic story. Her two stories that are always reprinted. One is The Idol of the Flies, and it's almost a reverse of Saki's Serenity Vashtar, where Saki is all on the side of the kid who worships the ferret out in the shack that eventually, solves his problems. The Idol of the Flies, the aunt that this little boy is being raised by is not a horrible person. She's a sympathetic person. And the kid makes an idol of shit and muck. It doesn't say shit, but that seems to be what it is, that he worships in the shed. And he does a lot of horrible things to the help and to other people and his aunt. And then his own idol turns on him, and it's, justice, the biter bit type story where this awful kid comes to an awful end. I didn't appreciate that story as a kid. It didn't traumatize me because I wanted the kid to come to an end, but I didn't really appreciate it. When I was in my teens, I realized it was brilliant. That's the first example I can think of. Mm-hmm. That would have been like 1941, 1942 in a pulp magazine. Very short, not short, very short, but short.
Well, the Midwich Cuckoos, John Wyndham, 1957.
Yeah. Of course.
One for parasitic children.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. See, I knew there was more. I just got stuck on the omen, and I'm like, I know there are earlier examples, but I do think generally we have, more creepy kids now as time has gone on. I think there's been a little bit less of a taboo, but I knew it was around before that. Thank you guys. Thank you all for answering that for me. So I'm like, I know I'm forgetting certain things, and the Bad Seed and definitely Midwich Cuckoos and Village of the Damned. Those kids are scary too. What is it about little blonde kids that scare us? Because she's a blonde in the Bad Seed, and those kids are blondes in Village of the Damned. Blonde kids are scary.
Man, the creepy kid trope had become so prevalent in what I think of as mainstream horror that developed in the 70s, and novels that sometimes got a movie deal, sometimes not. And of course, there was the double hitter of The Other and The Exorcist that were bestsellers at about the same time, and then movies came out a few years later. But I remember the trope had become so prevalent that by 1977, I think it was, when I discovered the first edition of Stephen King's The Shining, not The Shining, that came later, Salem's Lot at the Fayetteville Library, I remember having this breath of relief as 19-year-old me read it and realized that, wait a minute, this is not a creepy kid novel. Because I knew he'd written Carrie, I don't think the film had come out yet. And I thought of it as a creepy kid novel. But I suddenly realized that this was not another creepy kid novel, that it was about old-fashioned vampires. And it seemed refreshing at the time because it bucked the trend. And then when it came out in paperbacks, I was working at a newsstand. I'd already read it multiple times in the library. It had a die-cut cover with a creepy kid's face. So that, the trope was still so common that because remember, King didn't really conquer the bestseller list until The Shining. The trope was so common that they marketed that to look like it was about a creepy little, possibly a vampiric little girl.
And Brenda by Margaret St. Clair, which was made into an episode of Rod Serling's Night Gallery in 1971.
There's still a lot of night galleries I haven't seen yet, so I will look that one up.
I think it's available on YouTube. It might actually be
it
available. These are the kind of stories that we'll put in a reading list with the Outer Dark, so that you can try and find these stories and read them. Some of these classic stories, and if you're into reading about kids. Craig, Eden, do you have any thoughts on scary, on where the child is terrifying? Maybe the child is terrifying, but isn't actually a bad child.
Well, like The Exorcist,
terrifying to that's a good.
The Exorcist, and for years I only saw that when I was an adult, because there was something about the kid. Even when I was really young, I knew that that it wasn't the scene with the crucifix was not what they made it out to be, that it was actually a rape rather than masturbating with the crucifix. I don't know why so many people say that that's what that was. No, she's being raped by the demon. And to me, that terrified me more than anything, that something could control you and turn you monstrous and turn you into this sort of snot covered little thing. And I found that very haunting, and I actually couldn't watch it when I was a kid because it was just too much.
So I'm going to remind the audience out there that if you have any questions for the panelists, to start asking them. We have about 10 minutes or 12 minutes left, so there's still time. Somebody says, I'm a parent and I totally get more invested. Timal says, I'm a parent and I totally get more invested in the child protagonist in horror. So I think you're spot on. But my question is, ... Really all there. What are your top 1 or 2 classic monster types, whatever era that means, or even local lore?
Personally, I have always loved shapeshifters. There is something so sinister to me about someone that can take on the guise of a person that you know, love, trust, whatever have you, but within be something completely different that is looking to mine information from you in order to eventually destroy you. So shapeshifters for me have been sort of one of those top creepy, unsettling, and unnerving, get under your skin monsters, because it's so hard to finally figure out who it is. And until you find that secret of discovering what their weakness is, it's almost impossible to determine who they are or where they are.
Similar to that, doppelgangers have scared me. They scared me more as a kid. Now I'm like, if I met my own doppelganger, I'd be like, let's hang out. But like, I feel like, I'm older now and I've been like in my pandemic house for a while. So I don't think I'd be quite as afraid as I would have been as a kid. But the same type of thing as you were saying, Eden, this idea of somebody looking like someone they're not is very, very frightening. I haven't seen as many things done with doppelgangers. I would love to see even more. I of course think of the Twilight Zone episode with the doppelgangers, and that one was very, very scary. My other favorite monster, and this is like such a trope to even say, but I love vampires. I do. I think they're fun. I think you can do a lot of different things with them. I know it's like the obvious one, but I feel like if I had to pick, it was probably either Frankenstein or Dracula was the first monster movie I ever saw, and it was probably Dracula. So I think that's why it's still like my favorite monster, even though it's everybody's favorite monster. I feel like that's like the easy answer. But I also gave Doppelganger that way. I'm not just giving the easy answer.
Yeah, I'm going to cheat and say 3 because, and I wish child me had been as smart as Eden, because starting as a late teen, I started to feel the fear of, well, not just shapeshifters, but doppelgangers. But as a kid, I thought they were dull. And I'm embarrassed that my kid self thought that. But for instance, I wasn't interested in Who Goes There with the Thing being a shapeshifter. I like the movie The Thing, where it was a thing. And I like monsters that look like monsters. I didn't realize how brilliant Invasion of the Body Snatchers was until I was 15 or 16. It bounced off me as a kid. If the creature was my gateway monster, my love for giant monsters was something completely separate, because they never scared me at all. I just like to see them stomp on things. But I would say that the classic monsters that I first adopted were werewolf, well, not just the Wolfman, but any werewolf, because I wanted to be a werewolf. I wanted to have fangs and hair and scare people and maybe bite them, I don't know. And also Dracula, because I thought, and the weird thing was I just thought it'd be cool to walk around wearing a cape. I associated capes with monsters rather than superheroes. Monsters got to wear capes. Dracula, Phantom of the Opera, Mr. Hyde. If you were a monster, you wore a cape. You dressed well.
You were well dressed as a monster.
Yeah, yes.
Well, for me, it goes back to the Wicked Witch of the West. And the fact that she was just so unrepentantly evil. She was gleefully evil. She was like a manic pixie girl, but if she was evil. And there's something, I was watching it again the other day, and there's that lovely scene where Dorothy is crying and she sees Auntie Em and the crystal ball, and then the witch mocks her for actually wanting. And I'm just like, that is hardcore evil right there. She is straight up gangsta, She does not give an F about anything. And so, I would have to say witches were my gateway monster.
Gosh, this is tough because I love all the classic monsters for various different reasons. But if I to go on a slightly different topic from everyone else, I have a particular affection for the giant monster, for Godzilla, for Gorgo, and for King Kong.
Yes.
King Kong is truly an upsetting, but the original King Kong is a very upsetting and sad film. Because I really always felt for the monster, for the King Kong should have been left on the island. He should never have been brought to New York. When he gets there, what is he going to do? He's in this strange environment, which I think is scary to us all, being pulled out of wherever our comfort zone and being put in a completely alien place to him where everyone is afraid of him. And he can't possibly belong. Gorgo, I used to get Godzilla and Gorgo mixed up when I was a kid. I think that things happen in Gorgo happen in Godzilla.
Yes.
I cross-referenced them, but Gorgo had a child. So it was really, the monster, everybody was like, well, this is the monster. And then Gorgo's mother shows up and you're like, oh. So it was something very sweet. And when you had the little Godzilla was never as sweet as, kind of cute and silly, but Gorgo was super poignant, that the parent comes and rescues Gorgo. So I just love those movies. It just made me happy. It still makes me happy to watch a giant monster movie. Sometimes I get annoyed because there's too many people in them. And want to see the monster and not all this exposition. It's really about the monster. And and I still like the ones that were actual, like rubber monsters and models. Rather than the CGI doesn't always work as well, it seems.
Yeah, the monsters were always the best part of the big monster movies. No matter what they were, it was always like the people come on and you're like, oh, and we have to have these characters that we're not nearly as invested in as the monster. It's like you want to fast forward.
And kids sometimes had a relationship, like with Gamera and with Godzilla. Kids would have a special relationship with them, like they'd only talk to the kids, or the kids, that they had a special empathy with this one child. And you think, oh, if only I was that one child that Godzilla was my friend, or Gamera was my friend.
I'm sorry that I didn't get to see War of the Gargantuas early enough to be really traumatized with it, because I would love to know how my child me, who loved giant monsters, to not find them scary and just like to watch them. I mean, I really wanted to look out the window and see a giant monster stomping on houses in my neighborhood. But in War of the Gargantuas, the evil green Gargantua eats a woman and spits out her bloody dress. And it's just I'm sure it was, I know so many people who as kids were traumatized by that. I didn't see it until I was like 14. So it was like, wow, rather than, But I think that was probably the only terrifying classic Toho monster.
So we haven't gotten any more questions, Gwen says. So I wanted to see if anybody has closing thoughts. We've got 4 or 5 more minutes. So.
Well, I will mention a book that necessarily, I won't say that it scared me. I just found it morbidly fascinating because the morbid has always been fascinating to me. But Edward Gorey's The Ghastly Crumb Tinies is one of my, to this day, I absolutely adore not only the artwork, but just the tone and the unrepentant description of this is how each one of these little kids were killed with, and let's go in alphabetical order and make it very casually disturbing, and I always loved that book. I think I still have a copy of it around here somewhere, but it was just one of those sort of morbidly fascinating books that I read at a super young age. And it was, I think I just got a fascination with Gory's work and with the morbid, just starting with that book.
Who died of ennui?
Yeah.
That's my favorite one. I
Right?
used to,
Because
Yeah,
that's
sure.
something
Name.
that I could honestly see
Magnet.
doing.
Which kid was it?
Yeah.
I forget. I had a magnet of it up on my refrigerator for a while because I
It comes
loved
in
it
the
so
middle
much.
of the
I'm like,
alphabet.
yeah, dying of boredom, basically. I love that. But yeah, I love that you brought that up. I'm so happy that we mentioned Ember Gory. Thank you, Eden, because and that was I came across it at a young age. And again, because I was always like, oh, well, kids die. It was I thought kids were just dying left and right as a child. So it's well, here's 26 of them that die in these bizarre ways. And now when I'm older and I go back, man, Gory, you were take no prisoners. It's a brutal book.
I first encountered Gory through the classic anthology Hauntings, Tales of the Supernatural, which was edited by him and Herbert Mazio, and it was illustrated by Gory. And I got that in the 9th grade library and loved it. And I knew his art. And then I started noticing it in National Lampoon, where some of his stories that later appeared in Alpha Bestiary, that later appeared in Amphigory, appeared. And then, but I didn't really appreciate them. I didn't understand. I understood them, but I think they were bouncing off me in some way. But then at 19, I discovered, the first Amphigory, and I so fell in love with it. In fact, I was corresponding with the writer Fritz Leiber, who I was a huge fan of, and he told me I should pick this up because he loved it so much. And I just fell in love with Gory and his world. And so one of my huge disappointments was that, God, this is really low on the list of reasons that I'm sad my mother died, but I wish that I could have shared Amphigory with her, because she introduced me to Charles Addams through Nightcrawlers and the other classic collections of his cartoons. And this was her first book she ever read to me, Where the Wild Things Are. And I know that she would have so loved Edward Gorey. I think when she died, she probably just knew him as the artist on the classic Penguin Books editions. That wasn't Penguin, I forget who the publisher was, but of literature, where he did the really sexualized cover of a Melville novel with the sailor with a bulging crotch. And they're great covers. She probably mostly knew him from that. But I wish she could have seen Amphigory.
Well, it's funny that you bring up Maurice Sendak and all that stuff. He was actually more of a gateway at the beginning. And then when you find out that Maurice himself was gay and was sort of kicked out, it adds an extra sort of to the fact that Max was kind of a weirdo. It sort of fits in some ways.
And then The Night Kitchen.
Yeah.
I was just thinking of The Night Kitchen too. Yeah.
I didn't come across that one until I was well into adulthood. The only one I really came across of his as a kid was Where the Wild Things Are. So it's that one was a really big one for me. I just loved the monsters, and they scared me though. I'm I don't know, I want to hang out with these monsters. They're a little rough. They're wild. They live up to their names, but yeah. And then they threatened to eat him, and I was so upset. I'm he's your friend. You don't threaten to eat your friend.
So before we go, I realized that one author who seems quintessential in this category never got mentioned, Ray Bradbury. So as we go over the room, Something Wicked Where This Way Comes, and my favorite from childhood, The Halloween Tree, which when I got to meet Ray Bradbury, this is the book I took to get him to sign it.
Ooh.
And I love the illustration still. I actually, in prep for this panel, watched some of the TV movie based on it, which is free on Tubi right now, if anybody feels nostalgic and wants to go watch that or hasn't seen it. Obviously the book itself, I think is superior to the animated film by far.
Those wonderful illustrations.
But I forgot that Bradbury himself narrates the film, and Leonard Nimoy plays Moundsfeld in the film. So does the voice. So there is something special about it. But definitely read the book first if you're going to watch.
Yeah, definitely.
The book is magic. In the film, they also add a little girl. It's all boys in the book, but the witch becomes a little girl. And the witch is a boy. A boy dressed up as a witch in the book. But it's about the history of Halloween, and I won't say anything more in case somebody hasn't read it. But he was really magical writing about kids. He really seemed to tap into that, and of course, Stephen King is well known for that as well. I think sometimes Stephen King writes more interesting kid characters even than adult characters.
He does.
In some cases, not always. Revival, I love the first. I wish that first part of Revival with the kids, that's brilliant. After that, I don't know, should I say that book disappointed me in the end, but I love the first 100 pages with kids. That was vintage Stephen King. Okay, I guess we are at just beyond 2:30, so I think we're supposed to stop. If someone has anything you want to blurt out before we go, this is your chance. I think we kind of promoted everything in the intro. Did someone want to remind us of something? Oh, I've been told we have a minute or two, so if there's something you wanted to promo quick, new.
I have a short story collection that's coming out next year.
Yes. Awesome.
From who?
From Underland Press.
Okay. Do you have a title?
I'm so
for
looking
that yet?
forward to
It's
that.
called The Nectar of Nightmares.
Ah, great. Named after your Dim Shore
After my novella.
novella. That's a
or
wonderful
novelette, or The Nectar of Nightmares and Other Stories.
Oh, Gwen says let people know your website or social media. Where can they find you? So we'll start with Ian.
Ian Keith McDowell will run together at facebook.com. That's, I guess, my social nexus. I have Instagram and Twitter, but yeah. And it's also Ian Keith McDowell, at Ian Keith McDowell, Keith, like you would spell it, McDowell, McDowell. So yeah, that's basically it.
Gwendolyn? Where can they find you?
Gwendolyn, GwendolynKeis.com, and you can find me under my name at Facebook and Twitter.
Eden?
I'm EdenRoyce.com, my website that will have links to my Twitter and to my Instagram, which are at Eden Royce on Twitter and at Eden Royce Books on Instagram.
Right?
And on Instagram and Twitter, I am Ethereal Lad, one word. And from there, you can get to my website.
Awesome.
Yeah, and you can find me at anyamartin.com, ANYA I think that I have some website problems. If you don't find me today, my web mistress is working on it. I'm not 100% sure if it's fixed. So if you don't find me today, try again in a few days, in a day or two. It's my birthday, so going to my website, it would be nice if you can. But anyway, I'm also on Anya99 on Twitter. And you can find me on The Outer Dark at theouterdark.com and theouterdark.org. Thanks so much, everybody. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you
for doing this.
Bye.
And thanks for listening out there.
Thanks.
Watching.